ensayar rápido, no te sabes poner pie. Lo ensayas rápido, no te sabes poner pie.
Welcome back to Civil Discourse. Now, I am not Paul Ogden.
I'm not Mark Small, thank God.
We are here. We are here on December 8th, 2012, with Tom Ayer, who's a fundraiser for not-for-profit corporations, and Matt Stone, frequent guest, blogger on Indie Student. We've been discussing the Civil War, the events leading up to the Civil War, including the Dred Scott decision that ended up overturning a lot of the compromises that had forestalled the Civil War. We were just talking about John Brown at Harper's Ferry right before the break, and I was going to point out that I'd read an account by Frederick Douglass, who was a former slave and who was very prominent in the abolition movement before the Civil War. His description of John Brown dying, and how he was dying with his brother a few feet away, and all these people there, and he was at that point in his 60s, and he had rallied people to try and overturn the institution of slavery. And while some people viewed John Brown as being a very evil person for trying to raise an insurrection in the United States, a great many people viewed him as being a hero because he was trying to end slavery. And that was, but that was a pivotal point, and there were a lot of people who were prominent in the Civil War then that were there at that time.
Yeah.
There is one policy that led up to the Civil War that we haven't really touched on yet, and that's the colonization effort. The notion that these African Americans, most of whom were born in the United States, or at least North or Central America, and never known at least another continent, let alone a world such as Africa, that they should be freed, but they should be sent back to Africa.
By vote of a Congress of people who'd been here on this continent shorter periods of time than those individuals.
And what's in the history books, and I think I can speak to this because I have a younger sister who was in high school not too long ago, and I was in high school a bit longer ago than that.
Don't rub that in.
But that this part called the American Colonization Society, the group that pushed for Africans to settle somewhere in Africa and have them be a colony of the United States, kind of gets whitewashed as kind of mixed in with the abolitionist movement, that they were anti-slavery, that they were pro-civil rights. They genuinely didn't think the white man and the black man could exist free in the same society, and they really weren't. I mean, there might have been some genuine people in there that thought that they were equals, but that most society couldn't tolerate peaceful coexistence. But most of them were not friendly towards African Americans.
Well, they were trying to avoid the problem.
They were exactly. They were trying to avoid. They weren't comfortable with killing 20 million African Americans. They just thought it would be easier to ship them all out. And this gets whitewashed in the history books as kind of being like this compromise solution that just didn't work out. And whereas really it was something that's
Lincoln supported
it. Lincoln supported it.
Lincoln supported it.
Points. Yeah. And unfortunately, even the few African Americans actually did get over to Liberia. The government didn't really support them as a colony. It was poorly run.
Big surprise.
It was kind of a money pit. What little money the nation actually put into it, and it wasn't ever seen as really a serious effort to get freedmen and be part of a productive society.
So we have, and Lincoln had supported that. Lincoln at that point was, he had run for the United States Senate in 1858 and lost to Stephen Douglas. He was a principal in the founding of the Republican Party, even though he viewed himself as being a Whig, an old dyed-in-the-wool Whig. He ended up being nominated by the Republican Party for the presidency, and the platform of the party was abolitionist, but he really wasn't.
Well, and maybe Tom can speak a
And
bit
Tom-
more on this, but there are two or three factions of the Republican Party at the time. One was complete civil rights for African Americans, equal
Very
voting.
small group.
Yeah, but they were there.
Right.
And another were just specifically about slavery, about anti-abolition, and pro-abolition really. And another was kind of like just out there and wasn't really too concerned with slavery at all.
Yeah, in many respects, the Republican Party that came together in Chicago in 1860 was a real mess of various groups. You had
It originated in Ripon, Wisconsin.
Absolutely. You had former Democrats. You had Whigs that still thought of themselves as that way. You had Free Soilers. You had Know-Nothings that cared nothing for
the best political
the
party
Irish
we've ever had,
or Catholics or
that.
anything of that nature. But you had this whole mess of people coming together. Going into the convention, William Seward was considered to be the overwhelming favorite. And one of Lincoln's greatest skills that kind of gets, people put aside, he was without a doubt one of our greatest political maneuverers. And he had a great team of people to do that. And he managed to get, and his team, campaign manager, etc., managed to get a duplicate set of tickets to the convention printed so that his people showed up there, and the others that may have been supporting Seward or other candidates got locked out. So it was quite a maneuver on their part. And, so you had this convention of 1860. Seward is the favorite. Lincoln is considered to be the more moderate, and Seward is considered to be he had mentioned slavery as something that had to be voted out because it was subject to a higher law than the United States Constitution. He had made very radical statements prior to 1860. People thought he was just way too radical on the issue of slavery in terms of getting rid of it. And Lincoln was considered to be a moderate because of some of the statements that he'd made prior to then and so on. And essentially, in a great upset, he manages to get the nomination in 1860.
And then you have a four-way election, 4 candidates all viable in the election, and as a result of that, Abraham Lincoln won the presidency of the United States.
Right. But the thing about it, that particular election, is that people forget he got a very small percentage of the popular vote, was not even on the ballot in the South. But this really showed, at this point, the power of the northern states and the tremendous population that was there, the fact that he was able to win overwhelmingly in the Electoral College.
And when he arrived in Washington, D.C., after his election, prior to being inaugurated, the story is he came in by train and without any fanfare and under the dark of night so that people wouldn't know he was coming in. That's how it's depicted in Gore Vidal's novel Lincoln, which we're getting into fictionalized accounts of history.
But that's actually fairly accurate because by this point South Carolina had seceded and other southern states had followed, and you had some forming of a confederacy coming together.
But their fear was of Lincoln as an abolitionist president when he had said, if keeping the institution of slavery, if to preserve the Union we keep slavery, I'll keep slavery. If to preserve the Union we have abolition, I'll go for abolition. If to preserve the Union we do nothing, I'll do nothing. His chief goal was maintaining the Union, and then you have these southern states saying, well, no, that's not acceptable. And I can't see why it is that they were wanting to do that unless it was because, and this is another aspect of the war as it played out, no one understood the technology that had been developed for warfare such that bloodshed could be mechanized on such a large scale, so that you had a whole bunch of people. You had people for the first Battle of Bull Run going out from Washington, D.C. in carriages to watch the battle, thinking it would be merriment. But the other thing is, even then, something like 2/3 of the fatalities in the war were not from battle, but they were from dysentery and other camp diseases.
Well, we had a gap between 1860 and 1812. Well, there was no war fought really on American soil. I mean, we had the Texas Revolution, and we had the Mexican-American War, but that happened down there, out of the way of the average minds of people.
So you're saying that James Polk lied when he said that American citizens were massacred on American soil?
No, I'm not.
That's another show.
But if you look throughout history, when there's a long period of time between wars, people start romanticizing war and thinking of, oh, how great it was when we went out, we fought in these straight march lines and did these formations and the battle songs, and then we killed the enemy, we plant our flag, ta-da, victory. And then people start romanticizing, and then the wars actually started. Like, oh wow, wait a second, people die and bleed out, and we have to amputate limbs and stuff like that. Well, and that's what was happening with the American people. They thought that this was going to be a quick war. They thought that you would have these nice fancy formations. It's kind of like what the British encountered with the American revolutionaries.
Well, and even
where there was a new form of combat.
Well, even here in the Civil War, there really wasn't mass bloodshed until like July of 1861. I mean,
you could potentially argue that really until you started getting battles like Antietam and Shiloh in 1862 could people see the incredible bloodshed that was going to happen. But Matt points out that it really was. There was tremendous romance in this. And also the Southerners, the Southern Confederacy, was better equipped to win that war than we were in the Revolutionary War. And so in many respects, they had all rights to think, well, we can fight against these people and win without any problem because all they had to do was keep from being conquered. And we had to essentially conquer that entire area from Texas all the way up into Virginia, which is just incredible.
Not just that, but at the early onset of the war, the Southerners were the Confederacy got a lot of the talented,
the best generals.
Yeah, I mean, you had Lee, you had Stonewall Jackson, and many others going to the southern states.
What people don't miss also is the military leaders on both sides were trained in the Mexican-American War.
They were all buddies.
They were all classmates from West Point, and they knew each other. They might not like each other, but they knew each other. Grant's skills, people talk about how he was a poor student at West Point or something. He was a decent student at West Point. He was also one of the finest horsemen ever at West Point. And on top of that, when he was in the Mexican-American War, he was upset because he was a quartermaster. Because his skills were so good as a quartermaster. He could spot horses. He knew how to acquire horses. He was watching wagons go across a stream and was alarmed by the fact that there was no means by which you could prevent a carriage from coming down the bank and hitting a horse as you're trying to get and he developed a hitch so that wouldn't happen, and he was upset that they weren't putting him in combat. Those were skills that Grant acquired that really play out, where he was watching things and wasn't a military genius necessarily, because he was called a butcher, because he just threw numbers at the other side. But when you look at the South as the war developed then, you had parts of the South that were wanting to secede from the Confederacy because people thought it was a rich man's war, that people were dying so that slavery could be maintained for the benefit of a few people in the Confederacy, and they didn't believe in slavery anymore. At the same time as in the North, people thought it was a rich man's war because you could buy your way out of the war for $700.
Yeah, you had that once you had the draft brought in 1863, but certainly in the early days, really leading up until that tremendous bloodshed in 1862, there was tremendous romance and really a rush to join. They had no problem they had to turn away volunteers.
Yeah, but they had so many. For 90 days. They were enlisting for 90 days.
Oh, yeah, absolutely, because it's going to be over that quickly.
Yeah, sure.
And it wasn't just war on the ground. War at sea was being revolutionized as well, because we just got metal-plated ships that were developed during the Civil War.
The later days, particularly, was when we're at the end, later minutes of this segment, so we'll be right back.